It's 1922 in the Himalayas. A lime green jacket is hard to miss against Everest's white snow. Inside it is George Finch, the man that made climbing big mountains possible. His coat is stuffed with goose feathers and sewn from a hot air balloon fabric, and everyone says it looks ridiculous. The other men on his team topped out hundreds of meters below the point he is at. George and another climber set a new altitude record. But that's not the point of the story. It's the inventions he brought with that will go on to change mountaineering forever. Yet at this moment in time, he is higher than any human has ever stood. If today you dressed like the other men on his team, you'd be laughed off the mountain and called reckless. George was solving problems generations ahead of his time. And thanks to him, every oxygen mask and puffy coat you see on Everest today traces back to this strange, long-haired chemist they wanted to keep off the team. But at the time, he was an outcast, and his new methods were seen as cheating. So, how did he do it? To understand George, we have to go back to the beginning. From the age of 14, he knew that he wanted to climb mountains. When his family moved to Paris, he climbed the Notre Dame Cathedral with his brother. This was likely the first time he realized you can just do things. Keep that in mind because it's a common theme in this story. As he fell in love with climbing, the family moved again to Switzerland. Now, George finally had the chance at alpine peaks. And he took it pretty quickly. Most of his free time, he could be found climbing in the Alps. He might seem a little more nerdy from what I already told you, but that couldn't be further from the truth. George was more of a technical climber. This fits into his personality when you understand the times. Back then, it was unique how dedicated he was to take difficult routes up the mountains. At this time, a lot of things in the sport had not happened yet. There was no successful summit of K2 or even Everest. Most climbing was about making it to the top, not doing it the hardest way you can find. And while he later took the opposite approach of making climbing easier, this highlights how willing he was to go against the grain. In fact, the only real thing I could find on George that made him sort of fit in was becoming a chemist. And it was this career path that led him to London in 1913 for a research job. Then, when World War I happened, he volunteered and later saw action in Greece. This is a lesser detail, but what came after is important to this story. See, George came home to his wife right after the war. But things were different. George was greeted with a baby boy. Probably doing some quick math, George realized the boy wasn't his. It eventually became pretty obvious she had an affair, and in 1920, George divorced her, making him a divorcee in the year 1920, which was very frowned upon in society. This may seem like a minor detail, but it will make a lot more sense later. After the war, people started focusing on conquering the unknowns of the planet. The British, wanting to conquer everything, set their sights on Everest. Keep in mind, nobody had ever summited the tallest mountain at this time. So with a goal in mind, the planning began. There were a total of 3 British expeditions to Mount Everest from 1921 to 1924. George had made his desire to participate in all 3 expeditions clear. In 1921, he was denied based on medical reports that were stated to be politically biased. The same people that said that believe it was more likely that he was seen as anti-establishment. This is largely due to the image he had. George had long hair, which made him a rebel, and that's not even mentioning his past. Remember that divorce he had from his cheating wife? Well, like I said, that didn't look very good at the time. Despite the reason for the divorce, it somehow reflected poorly on him. So whether it was a combination of these things or something we will never know, he didn't get to go. By the time the 3rd expedition came around in 1924, they threw everything at him. From his Australian birth to his unconventional views, they didn't want to include him. Since all 3 of these expeditions were British, it seems there may be some validity to the Australian claim. But when you break it down, it doesn't really add up. And to top it off, George was barely from Australia other than being born there. And he literally fought in World War I for the British. It seems to me he was as British as the next person, but they didn't see it that way. But it's likely this isn't the reason he wasn't invited. And you may be asking yourself why I am talking about him not going to Everest, considering this video has Everest in the title. Well, as I said, there were 3 expeditions, and George was actually selected for the 2nd expedition in 1922. He was not a popular choice for this expedition by the trip's leader, Charles Bruce. I never figured out why he was ultimately allowed to join in 1922 when they seemed to hate him so much, but regardless, he was included here. Remember when I said it was considered cheating to use oxygen tanks? Well, this was fueled by the fact many viewed these things to be the wrong way to climb. It was very common at the time and still is in some circles to think that oxygen is cheating. People that hold this perspective look at it the same way as someone taking steroids to hit home runs in baseball. And this is stupid ultimately because this is so commonplace today, especially with mountains near the elevation of Everest. And in this expedition, you can see the evidence of that. There were a total of 3 attempts made for the summit during this expedition. The first attempt was done without oxygen. I will explain more in a moment, but what you need to know now is they turned around at 8,225 meters. The second attempt was by George, Geoffrey Bruce, and Tabir Burra, and these guys had oxygen. They also didn't make it to the summit of Everest, but what they did do is make it to either 8,321 or 8,380 meters depending on who you ask. But the reason this is so important are the things I am going to share next. Both of the teams had made it to the point above 8,000 meters, or what is otherwise known as the death zone. A place where atmospheric pressure doesn't let the human body work properly. I won't go into too much detail, but what you need to know is this. Higher pressure is bad because it saturates hemoglobin, which binds your oxygen to your red blood cells. This isn't to say it's impossible to enter the death zone without oxygen, but it's important to note that you can never fully acclimate. Sleeping is very difficult, digesting food is nearly impossible, and walking feels like you're running with a pillow over your mouth, which is exactly some of the issues the first team faced. The porters on this team slept so poorly that when they woke up, only 5 of them kept going higher. The next day, one guy had to climb down because a rucksack with food fell down the mountain, and when he got back, he was too tired to go any further. When it then started to snow and everyone was slipping, they turned around. Now, it certainly is possible to make it to the top without oxygen. Like I said, this is something people do today. But with the other gear available at the time, which I will cover shortly, and the fact it had never been done, this was a tall task. So we know that George's attempt went different, but why didn't he make the summit? Well, everything actually started out way better than the first team. Since they were able to breathe and sleep, they had an easier time. The porters were even faster and able to carry heavier loads. But trouble later struck around 7,925 meters when Tabir turned around because his coat couldn't hold up to the wind. After this, George and Bruce adjusted their route and kept pushing on. Later, the two turned around because Bruce had an issue with his oxygen system. Because of this issue, we will never know if George could have been the first to summit Everest that day. A few days later, all the men began planning a third attempt, and the men who were from the first team now wanted to use oxygen. George got sick very early up the mountain and was forced to turn around. This ended up probably saving his life because the team later encountered an avalanche. Many of the men died and the expedition was forced to end as a result. So that third attempt would have made it to the summit if there was no disaster, right? Well, even though they had oxygen, I am not convinced they would have made it to the summit. Remember when George's teammate turned around from the cold? Well, George wasn't facing the same problems because he was wearing a down jacket. They ultimately made that route correction to get out of the wind, likely because his teammate was also freezing. See, that type of jacket he was wearing is what mountaineers now use when they climb mountains. And George, from what I can tell, was the first person to make one. But nobody else on the expedition would wear one. The coat was more of a problem because they didn't like the way it looked. It was common at the time for mountaineers to wear many layers of wool and a tweed jacket. I have covered why wool is a really bad choice in my video about Eddie Bauer creating America's first down jacket, but I will give you a short recap. Wool is bulky, heavy, and it doesn't breathe. In Eddie Bauer's case, it almost killed him when he became super sweaty soaking his coat. The wet coat became frozen in the wind and Eddie quickly got hypothermia. But even though the downfalls of wool were widely known, George's team still didn't want it. And more or less, these men were willing to risk their life for fashion. To make the jacket durable, George decided to make it out of a used hot air balloon. And honestly, when you look at the picture of him wearing it, you won't notice anything out of the ordinary. But these guys were from the 1920s. Compared to what people wore, it looked really weird. It can't be seen in the photo since it's black and white, but like I said, the jacket was also bright green. And that part was just the cherry on top. This may seem completely ridiculous to us today, but let's put ourselves in their minds. As stupid as this is, let's just try and imagine ourselves as a bunch of guys from the 1920s. It's not as dressy as the jacket worn by the other guys in the expedition. And to understand that, remember at the time, people didn't wear jeans and a t-shirt. Looking dressed up in public directly correlated to what people thought about you. To put this in modern terms, it's kinda like when you see someone in public wearing Cookie Monster pajamas. The men actually hated the jacket so much that they resorted to acting like middle schoolers. They literally sent each other notes mocking the jacket. But ultimately, we know from history that George was right. And to top the whole thing off, on the third expedition 2 years later, 2 of the men would die in tweed jackets somewhere near the summit. They did have an oxygen mask, so they likely froze to death by refusing to wear the jacket that George designed. I think it's an interesting part of the story that it's easier for me to rag on the other British climbers from all the expeditions. And that's largely because over time it was proven that George was right. His inventions were 2 huge factors that changed the way people will climb forever. A lot of people wouldn't think twice about climbing Everest without oxygen today, and they would certainly laugh at you if you tried to get them to wear tweed. It's also entirely possible, given his invention's relevance today, that George could have made the push for the summit of Mount Everest in 1922. Long after George gave up mountains, Edmund Hillary reached the summit of Mount Everest in 1953, making him the first known person to reach the top of the world. And he made sure when he got there to acknowledge George and his inventions. But regardless of the fact his name was never widely known, the cover of Life magazine showed 2 climbers in down jackets with oxygen masks on the cover shortly after. And with the first summit in known history showing off both his inventions, George became the man that made it all possible. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you'd like to support our team, check out our Patreon and have your name shown in the credits. We really appreciate all our patrons. You are making this dream and these videos possible. Go check out the link in the description and sign up to become a patron today. And if you want to rep some awesome outdoor gear, check out the Outdoor Origins store. Your support will one day help us make all sorts of gear right here in the United States. And if you liked this video, you will absolutely love the next one showing on the screen right now. It's exactly what we think you'll want to see next. Thanks for being a part of the Outdoor Origins community, and we'll see you in the next one.